Hi, this is Dan in Nature. I'm Dan, and I live in the redwoods. I live in a tent under the redwoods on about 4 acres. What was that sound? And this sound? And this sound? Those are indeed very different sounds. Sounds are many things. Sounds are one type of vibration. That was a beautiful sound. I live in a tent under the redwoods on almost 4 acres of land. And I'm trying to live sustainably. What does that mean? That's a beautiful bird sound. Thank you to the birds. Thank you to that bird for making such a beautiful sound for all of us to enjoy. I'm grateful. I'm feeling grateful to that bird. And that bird, I don't think lives on my 4 acres, but maybe I'm wrong about that. That bird is supported by there being 4 acres of redwoods where I live. That bird does not live in the universe alone. That bird's environment is connected to the grub and worms and other insects and nourishment it can find in these woods. And these woods support a wide variety of life. A bird living alone in 4 acres will eventually deplete its resources because the resources are not stable. There's a smile of gratefulness on my face right now for that bird and that bird song. And so that bird thanks me in return for keeping these 4 acres plentiful, natural, for putting care and thought into which trees I will be taking down. Eventually, in 4 acres surrounded by parking lots, that does not describe where I live, but in 4 acres surrounded by parking lots, I hear a truck in the distance now. I'll use my skill of patience. In 4 acres of redwoods surrounded by parking lot, I would expect that the worms might burrow underground and leave the side of the forest where the first parking lot was built, and then leave the side of the forest where the second parking lot was built, and then leave the side of the forest where the third parking lot was built, and then leave the side of the forest where the fourth parking lot was built. And what would be left would be only a few worms and insects that didn't escape. And those worms would eat the nourishments that they found, and those insects would eat the nourishments that they found. Nourishments like, if you're a mosquito, blood is a nourishment. And because there are less worms, there are also less birds and other animals that depend on worms. And the soil with far fewer worms becomes less nutrient dense, and the trees start to fail. And the forest changes. And because there are less worms and other insects, and also because the trees start to fail, the birds start to leave the area. I imagine that these birds will start to leave this quarantined forest, quarantined with parking lots. A quarantined redwood forest surrounded by an urban forest. So we'll call it an urban forest, a parking lot. And I imagine that the birds that lived in that redwood forest, experiencing the changes of the forest, would choose to find better homes elsewhere. And they would leave those 4 acres of forest. And we would not be able to hear the beautiful bird songs. Maybe other birds would come in. Maybe birds that scavenged from dead things found in parking lots, like I almost said flattened hamsters, like roadkill, like mammals that flourish in dumpsters. Things change. Forests change. About 120 years ago, a little less, San Francisco and the surrounding Bay Area experienced a massive earthquake, and that almost or nearly leveled the city. And that was in 1906. And at that time, of the Great San Francisco earthquake. I believe the people of San Francisco felt desperate to rebuild, to rehome people who had become homeless when their homes shook down to their foundations and crumbled. Now, at that time, people were cutting down redwood trees in this area and using the lumber to build homes. And in fact, I once upon a time owned a home that was built in 1920, whose walls and floorboards are made of redwood. Now, in 1906, after the San Francisco earthquake leveled that city, I believe that mayors and politicians and city council members and other spokespeople for the city asked the people of this land to sell them their old redwood trees, to let them cut down this forest, to rebuild San Francisco. And so this land, 119 or so years ago, was clear cut. As I understand it, it turns out those trees were used to fire furnaces to build bricks. Because San Francisco is a big city and they needed bricks. And they needed lots of bricks. So, almost all of the trees in this forest, in the land that I live on, the 4 acres that I live on in my tent, was clear cut. And it started over again about 100 and so years ago. So the oldest trees here today are about 100 years old. There's some beautiful redwoods. And when I drive along the road into town, out of town, away from town, I see some other redwood trees that are 200 years old, 500 years old, maybe 1,000 years old. I've seen redwoods that are almost 2,000 years old. Most of those old trees are not alive anymore, but you can still see their remains, their stumps. And before that, I don't know what this land was. I could call it an old-growth redwood forest. That wouldn't fully describe it. I could mention that there were some people that lived here. I know that there is a family that took care of these lands back then, and they go by the name Parmeter. And they were the caretakers of this land, of all the land around here, as far as I understand it. And to me, putting care and thought into which trees I will cut down is so important. To me, because I want to be a caretaker of this land. Because I, in addition to many things, I am also a caretaker of this land. That means something special to me. Because I value sustainability, and that this land becomes more sustainable for me when I'm putting care and thought into my actions, as many of my actions as I can. I find that the easiest way to put care and thought into my actions is to be a role model for myself. I would love for this land to be grown into another old growth redwood forest. I would love to see this world turned back into a forest that sustained human life, massive amounts of human life, which is what we have today. We have massive amounts of human life on this planet. And I am not alone in believing that I can see that as a gift. I have heard from people who believe that the problem with the world are humans. That humanity is a failed experiment. Humanity is humanity. If I believe that humanity is an experiment at all, I will treat humanity very differently than if I believe humanity is humanity. Part of humanity is the natural evolution of people into what we have today and hopefully what we will have in the future. So what does it take for me to live sustainably on these 4 acres? Aside from hoping that the acres surrounding this property remain forested, I could live minimally. I could move minimally. I could exert only enough energy that it would take me to hunt and gather the calories that I need to survive. A meager existence. I could cut down enough trees to build a greenhouse, and I could make a agricultural wonderland by removing certain trees. I could make this sustainable for me. How many trees would I need to cut down to make this sustainable for me? How many trees would I need to cut down to make this sustainable for my family? How does that change the environment around me when I do that? If I don't do that, will I be able to find the sustenance that I need to survive here? If we look at sustainability as a problem that needs to be solved, we can invent something called money. And we can move outside of our 4 acres. And I can exchange some of my knowledge or goods for something called money. And I can take that money and I can use it to exchange it for something called food. But in order to get that food, I need to transport it here to this property, to where I live. Which means I need to walk far distances. Or I need to drive in a car that uses fuel. And I'm not talking about a steam engine train. I could ride a bicycle into town and purchase that food. But even then, that food was brought to that town with trucks and ships. Is the money that I earned from my knowledge or goods going to produce a sustainable environment in my 4 acres if the trucks that bring my favorite Amy's lentil soup to the grocery store create more roads and parking lots than forest, and ultimately end up suffocating the forest that I am the caretaker of? I don't control how the Amy's lentil soup cans get to the grocery store. I don't have control over other people's actions. And my thoughts and actions do, in fact, influence other people's thoughts and actions. And if I buy Amy's lentil soup at the grocery store, and it is being transported using fossil fuels, then I am supporting burning fossil fuels. I am supporting an industry of unsustainable agriculture. What does this mean for me? Does this mean that I give up this idea of living sustainably on 4 acres? No. I think what this means, I think the important lesson I want to remind myself today, an important lesson I want to remind myself today, is that I can have values that I am not able to live up to. And that is how I define okay. That is okay. I live in the real world, and I know that. And in my ideal world, I would have a much easier time living up to my values, living sustainably on 4 acres. I don't live in my ideals. I live in the real world. And for me today, living in the real world, living sustainably on 4 acres would mean giving up too much. Giving up more than I am willing to give up. So, I will continue to strive to realize my dreams, knowing that I will fail and fail again and fail often. Thanks for tuning in to yet another episode of Dan in Nature. I hope to hear from you, and I hope to see you here next time. Peace.